My name is Victor Galley, and I'm the president of the Penn Vegan Society, an academic student organization at the University of Pennsylvania. In arranging the event this evening, we sought to bring you one of the most exciting voices in health today. We believe Dr. Campbell's work is remarkable and represents a paradigmatic shift in questioning the extent to which personal behavior and environmental influences are nothing less than inextricable from questions of disease initiation, promotion, and progression. Our hope is that by the time Dr. Campbell has finished, you will have a different insight into the extent to which food can be a transformative factor for health and disease treatment. If you decide to follow suit with Dr. Campbell's recommendations for a dietary behavioral change, we encourage you to use our organization as a resource in that process. Also, if you wish to support the work we do on campus to raise the level of discourse around food and health issues, please see me or one of my board members after the presentation. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. T. Colin Campbell, the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor of Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University, has authored over 300 peer-reviewed articles. He has served numerous scientific, policymaking, and regulating bodies, including the National Academy of Sciences, the American Institute for Cancer Research, and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as having served as principal investigator of multiple highly renowned studies, including the Cornell-Oxford China Project, the world's most comprehensive human nutrition study, which the New York Times labeled as the Grand Prix of epidemiology. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our speaker, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Victor, and welcome. Certainly a very nice group of people here. I'm looking forward to exchanging some ideas with you. I would like to thank Bruce Rogers for playing a big hand in getting this organized, and I'd like to thank his mother, Loretta, for having Bruce Rogers and coming here tonight. I guess you know what I'm going to be talking about or trying to talk about. Really has to do with what we eat, what we get from our food. I have been at this game for a long time, more than half a century actually, when I went away to graduate school at Cornell University. And at that time, when I did, I was involved in some research, or my doctoral research at least, that turns out now to be diametrically opposed to what I now say. And so it's been quite a journey. It's been a long journey. I've had lots of students, a lot of colleagues who've worked with me, and I'm very grateful for all the collaborations that I've had over the years. But it turns out that my story, at least, starting from here and coming essentially over about here, it was kind of an interesting journey in the sense that it went in so many different directions. And there were bumps in the road, and there's still bumps in the road, and that kind of thing. And so I've finally gotten to a place right now where I'm quite frankly quite enthusiastic about what this information is all about. And I think it really has a lot of potential to do a lot of good, starting with our own personal health, but even more than that, graduating into an effect on our environment and our friends and colleagues in so many different ways. And so because of the sort of complexity of this issue, there's so many different ways I could talk about this, and I do from time to time, all the way from the environment to personal health to other kinds of issues. And I can't do that unless you're willing to sit here for, let's say, a month without getting out of your seats. There's so much to talk about. And fortunately, in the last few years, I've gained a lot of colleagues, some colleagues who were around doing this kind of thing themselves before I got to know them, and so we're kind of forming a community these days. And the word is spreading. I'm really quite excited about the fact that you've heard the tipping point. I think we're getting close to a tipping point, in spite of what a lot of people don't. There's some people that are still around, don't understand it, don't want to hear it, sort of look back, but we're getting someplace with this idea. So there's many different ways that I could talk about it. And the way I usually like to talk about it, especially to a more general kind of audience like this, is to describe, in a sense, how did I sort of learn this, because I started over here and came over here, as I said. And so I'm going to sort of tell this story, just hitting a few highlights through my own career and research primarily, mostly at Cornell University, incidentally, and tell it, in a sense, a little bit chronologically, because there were certain things that I learned with my students and other colleagues in my research efforts and also in policy development. I spent about 20 years, actually, almost 20 successive years involved in national policy development in the area of food and health, serving on these so-called expert panels and other kinds of committees and getting involved and giving testimony before congressional hearings and that sort of thing. And I happened to see, basically, or get a feel, if you will, for this question, why haven't we heard this before? Because I really find it really quite exciting, and that's usually one of the questions that really comes up. And so I'm going to just kind of summarize, start out with some science and some research and see how it sort of changed. Let you decide for yourself if you haven't heard this before, and then end up trying to focus a little bit on that question, essentially why we haven't heard it before and where I think we might be headed. So, there's my question. And I want you to take note of one particular word in that. It's the word therapy. Nutritional therapy in medical practice. Is it real? Is it just imagined? Or is it alternative? And that word is kind of special from my way of looking at things, because I'm sure you've heard from your grandmothers in years past, eat your vegetables and all that kind of good things so you don't get something in the future. And that gradually evolved into the concept of preventive medicine. And so to the extent that nutrition was discussed halfway seriously, at least in the medical profession, it was primarily discussed in the context, if you eat these foods here, you won't get some diseases later. And so there was this sort of segment called preventive medicine, and that became sort of a discipline, a curriculum, if you will, in many medical schools across the country. Unfortunately, even though we've heard about preventive medicine, and still to yet today, you'll hear people sort of advocating for the idea, we got to talk more about preventive medicine. We've got to put some money into that and that kind of thing. Quite frankly, I'm going to suggest for your thinking that preventive medicine never really did evolve into a really serious medical discipline. It's sort of a stepchild at best within our health and medical communities. And so that's preventive medicine, what nutrition can do to prevent you from getting something in the future. And there's a lot of truth in that, by the way. Don't want to diminish that. That is certainly important. It just doesn't get the kind of attention that I think it deserves. I'm going to suggest, however, that therapy, there's a different kind of concept. This effect of diet on our health is so pronounced and so profound, not just in, making us healthy so we don't get problems in the future, but now the same formula, done better than we usually do it, the same formula can actually be used to treat ongoing existing illnesses now. And that part of it, that's all about treatment. It's about therapy. And now we're getting into the domain of traditional medical practice as a result of that. So, and I just see that concept, that notion that if you're sick, even with some of the advanced diseases, and if you try this, what I'm going to describe, it's interesting. The benefits really are turning out to be rather remarkable. And it's an area that we haven't really heard too much about. So on with the issue. As I say, we have a problem, a health problem. We have not only a health problem, we also have a health care cost problem, of course, that we've all heard about. That's the nature of this so-called debate that we've been having for the last 3 or 4 years without much progress, it seems like to me. We're going to be breaking our bank. And so we got lots of problems. There's a lot of sub-problems associated with that. But I'm going to suggest we also have a solution. It just hasn't been very well told yet. I hope it will be. And the solution really has to do with our choosing which food to eat. And the sad part of this is that few people really know this information. When I say people don't know the information, I'm talking about average folk, haven't really heard much about this. And there's terrible confusion on this question because there's nutrition in the public marketplace. There's no question about that. But when I say few people, I'm also saying the professionals. The professionals in my community, biomedical research. I consider myself a member of the biomedical research community, but also in my sort of allied profession, like in medical practice. So amongst the professionals, the health professionals, also, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of knowledge existing there. So just to emphasize what I just said a moment ago, few people know that the same strategy can be used for treatment, basically, as well as, did that come across? My sentence fell off. I don't know, maybe I should look under the computer here someplace. I don't know where it is. Few people know that the same strategy can be used for treatment as well as for prevention. Now, how many of you have read the China study? Quite a few. How many of you have not read the China study? Oh, we've got about 50-50 split here, I think. So it's worthy to sort of summarize a little bit what's in the China study. And forgive me for those of you who already know the story, so I'll tell it in my own words this time, instead of letting the book say it. In the beginning of my career, as I mentioned, I came from this over here, and what that meant by that is I was raised on a dairy farm in Virginia, and I milked cows until I went away to school, by hand as well as by machine. And so I was a farm boy, went to Cornell eventually, into graduate school, and did my doctoral research on basically following up what I thought I knew, and of course my professors thought that's what I should do anyhow, namely consuming the good old American diet, rich in animal foods, high in protein, high in fat. I thought then that was the way to go. So my doctoral dissertation actually was focused on specifically how do we grow more protein so we can consume more of it, especially the high quality protein. Everyone wants high quality. High quality protein meant animal-based protein. And so I got in doing that, believed in it, published some few things, and then eventually went off to the Philippines, coordinating a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children. As part of the U.S. State Department with the contract. I was at that time at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biochemistry, but I went to the Philippines with my senior colleague, and we were setting up a nationwide program for feeding malnourished children. And in that effort, I went there with this idea. I mean, it wasn't my idea. It was all of us in this community went there that what we needed to do for these children was to make sure that these children got enough protein. Because that was the story in those days. Poor children, malnourished children, starving children, and in the poor countries around the world, they were that way because, from a nutritional perspective at least, they were that way either because they weren't getting enough food, or calories, and that was called marasmus, or they weren't getting enough protein, in which case we call it by this technical term kwashiorkor. And so we went to the Philippines to try to figure out ways to introduce the opportunity of children getting more protein. But while I was there and doing that, and I also had wearing another hat at that time, and that was to try to understand something about cancer. How does it really work? And I just happened to, one day when I was on the golf course actually with my medical colleague, he told me that he and some of his surgeon friends had been operating on children 4 years of age and younger for primary liver cancer. Now that was really odd. I mean, just kind of, it's a hearsay kind of thing. It wasn't published. It wasn't official. Nothing like that. This is just what he said, and I paid some attention, of course. But it was really strange because these children were getting at a very young age a disease that generally occurs in middle to older age. And so I'm interested in cancer, interested in making sure they got enough protein. The two ideas are sort of coming together. I just was inquiring around, and come to find out, got the impression that the children who were getting, not a lot of children, the children who were supposedly getting primary liver cancer at a very young age like this, which indicated there's a bigger problem with middle-aged people, but in any case, those children who were getting this liver cancer were actually coming from the few families who were consuming the most protein. I mean, in general, in the Philippines, a rather poor country, they weren't getting enough protein. We all knew that, so we thought. But there are few families, the richer families, they were the ones getting more protein like we consume, and it was their children that, in fact, seemed to be getting the liver cancer. Now, that's only part of the story. If there's any medically inclined people in here, you'll know that there's another factor that comes into play in primary liver cancer. It has to do with hepatitis B virus, big issue. But we didn't know it in those days, and so that certainly was a role. But the key thing was that it turned out that these children were coming from families consuming the most protein. So all of a sudden we had a dilemma, we had a paradox. We're going there to give them more protein, yet on the other hand, the families getting the most protein looked like they may have a problem. So then there was this here particular paper here came out from India at the time. It was published, obviously. And this was a study involving experimental animals, in this case, experimental rats. And what these researchers were doing at that time, they were also interested in liver cancer. And they were using experimental animals to study liver cancer. And they had this idea, this hypothesis, that maybe liver cancer tended to be more common in some countries because they weren't getting enough protein. That was the idea. So they organized a study and said, okay, let's do a study where we got one group of animals given really good, generous levels of protein, what's generally recommended. In the other case, you get much less, quite frankly, quite a low level. And so in both cases, these animals had been exposed to a carcinogen that causes liver cancer. So there was two groups, one lower protein, one higher protein, and they did the study. Their hypothesis was the ones got the highest level of protein would have the least cancer. So there's the results they got. The ones given the 20% of total energy, they got 100% of the animals. It wasn't a big study, it was a small study, but 100% of the animals got liver cancer. In contrast, the animals given the lower levels, none did. That was pretty remarkable. And it was at the time, it was a reasonably obscure journal, but in any case, I took note of it just simply because of having heard or seen or thought, the possibility that humans too might be responding in some ways. And so here I'm sort of saying, wow, more protein, more cancer, on the one hand, at least this kind of cancer, and here's a study showing in experimental animals getting the same thing. This paper here and my own personal observations then led to coming back home. At that time it was still Virginia Tech before I came back to Cornell. I organized a program that was funded by the National Institutes of Health that was to continue for the next 27 years, this one particular project. And so we studied this question in great depth. I got interested in, first off, seeing if we could reproduce this information. We like to do that in science. See something so provocative like that, protein pushing cancer or causing cancer. And so we wanted to do it and see if we could do it ourselves. That was number one. Number two, I wanted to know, how does it work? In medicine and things like that, we like to know how it works. We call it explanatory mechanisms. The biochemical stuff that goes on inside of the body. We wanted to know that. So we wanted to look to see how it works. And okay, there's the paradox, to get more protein, more cancer, which is kind of odd. So we did lots of studies over the years, and I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 sort of representations of that information, some of the more provocative representations, and just to show you how this eventually sort of evolved into a much larger context. Here's a graph showing you what happens during the early stages of liver cancer in these animals, from 0 days up to, or 0 weeks up to 12 weeks. So for about the first 3 or 4 months or so, you can see the animals given the 20%, that early cancer was growing really quite well. You can see it there. The animals given 5% is not growing at all, in spite of the fact that the animals have been given a very potent or exposed to a very potent carcinogen. They're getting protected. The lower protein animals are basically not allowing the cancer to grow. That's the same as I just showed you from the Indian stuff. So I thought, okay, we're on the same track. This right here, though, was one of the first of many, many heresies that I ran across. I kept running across things that weren't accepted, were sort of novel, different, and people questioning me, I guess, of what we were doing. But in reality, all these heresies finally started to aggregate at the end of the day into what I call principles and a whole new paradigm of thinking. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. Look at that. The animals given the 20% protein, the red bars, first 3 weeks it's growing. If you switch them to low protein, you turn it off. give the high protein, turn it back on again, turn it off. That's pretty dramatic. I mean, that's just really showing you that this cancer, we could turn on and turn off this cancer just by how much protein we gave to the animals. And the higher levels of protein was turning it on, lower levels of turning it off. And we did this in many different ways. So we really convinced ourselves that this concept that nutrition, in this particular case, a nutrient, fed at more or less routine levels of intake, had this dramatic effect of being able to affect this experimental cancer. So we went beyond that. Oh, here's another way of looking at the same thing. Basically, if we start out with 5% for the first 9 weeks or so, cancer not growing, you would have thought by this time, that carcinogen was way back at the beginning, whatever damage was causing, you would have thought it would have been gone by now. The body would have repaired that, and it would not be remembered. But for going 9 weeks on the low-protein diet, cancer not growing, turn around, put some protein back into it, the higher levels, you turn it back on again. I mean, there's a lot of features of that particular kind of analysis that is quite exciting. Let me just jump ahead here and just tell you one of the conclusions, I think one of the generalizations I think is fair to say. Namely, we all have cancer cells in our bodies in virtually all of our tissues at the infant stage. Let's call them infant cancer cells. We're acquiring and getting this kind of thing all of our lives, but that doesn't mean we're going to get cancer. It doesn't mean that at all. But since we have that propensity or that predisposition to get that kind of problem, if we start fertilizing all those seeds lying there, we can get them to grow in some cases, and that's really a factor of what kind of nutrition we happen to experience. Okay, so what I just showed you is the early stages, cancer first nine weeks. Cancer tends to grow over the lifetime of us and any species. It takes a long time. Usually that's at least the general consideration. And so we said, okay, let's do a study for the lifetime of these animals, which in fact is 2 years, 100 weeks. We started out in the beginning with a 5% and 20%. This actually was part of a larger study. And so at the end of the 2 years, or 100 weeks approximately, it turns out that the animals given the 20%, you see they have full-blown cancers, tumors. It's not early cancer. This is the whole thing. This is the whole 9 yards. See that big number there? And the animals given 5%, even after 2 years of lifetime, the animal cancer never showed up. Those animals didn't really seem to have any cancers, despite of the fact they had been exposed to a very potent carcinogen. The most, I should say, the most powerful carcinogen ever discovered. So here, look at this though. The animals given the 5%, they didn't have any cancers. They were actually consuming a little more energy, a little more calories. Low protein, this is the key. They were consuming low protein diets. At the end of 2 years, when that's the end of their life, they're expected to have died by then or getting close to it. You can see all those animals are living. And very energetic and very healthy looking. They had sleek hair coats and jumping around in a cage. They were metabolizing energy in certain kinds of ways. It was all really very fascinating, actually. And the animals given the 20% protein, the good levels, that good old protein, all these animals that are dead from cancer. So here is, again, really a dramatic, affirmation of what, in fact, had been found in India. So let's move on then. And now here's a little sidebar story, in a sense, we've got to keep in mind. I don't mean to say that protein is I don't mean to say that protein is all bad. It's not. Protein is a central nutrient. We have to have protein. Of that, there is no doubt. But this illustration here shows, I think, puts a little finer touch on that idea about what protein does. Namely, we wanted to know, let's use different levels of protein. You sort of gradually increase and see how much effect it had on the cancer. So diets that had 4% and 6% and 8% and 10%, essentially, those animals weren't growing any cancer, in spite of the fact that they had been exposed to a carcinogen. It's only when they had enough protein to satisfy their needs, and incidentally, in the case of these rats, that's probably around 6-7% or so. But when they got up to 10%, you see they're sort of using most of their protein for good purposes, no problems. So the protein that really works is a protein that's fed in excess of the amount normally needed. So we're talking about protein fed in excess. Well, you might ask yourself, well, what does that have to do with us? I mean, what levels of protein, does that have anything to do, could we be suspicious about anything about the levels of protein we're consuming? It turns out the amount of protein that we need and the amount of protein that rats need is about the same. Right around 8-10% or so like that. And so right there is a traditional human consumption range. So most of us, 95% of us, are in the range from about 11% to 22% protein. We're in the territory. We're in the kind of red zone. You know, we're depending on how much protein, I mean, in theory, depending on how much protein we're actually consuming in our diets routinely, we can expect to see, according to this, if you extrapolate it out and generalize about it a little bit, that would suggest that the higher levels of protein could, possibly create some problems to all of us, depending on what our protein uses were. Now, so that was the answer to question number one. You know, could we repeat what the Indian workers had done? Well, we did. We repeated it in spades. In fact, went much beyond what they had done and really were convinced that this really works. The second question was, as I said, we tried to figure out, how does this work? So we looked for all different kinds. These are a lot of biochemical stuff, and I don't want to get into the details of that, really kind of complex biochemistry and chemistry, but we were looking for the particular mechanism that might account for this. And usually each one of these mechanisms would take 3 or 4 years of research, doing experimental research. It usually involved a PhD thesis or so, this consumed the lives of a few graduate students of mine who worked on one thing at a time, and we kept looking for the mechanism. And listed there, the first stage of cancer formation is initiation, second stage is promotion. Okay, and these are a bunch of things that I won't get into that unless you're inclined to want to know something about that. So we kept looking for the mechanism. And every time we looked for the mechanism, we found one. It was kind of frustrating. And what are we going to look for next? It was these mechanisms, here they are in the beginning, here they are a little bit later in the cancer process. And so finally I got the impression, and I'm really quite excited about this notion these days, there is no such thing as the mechanism for the most part, or most of these kind of disease causation sort of phenomenon. It turns out when something happens, you do something here wrong or right, or whatever it is, you do something over here, the cause, and you get this over here sometime later. In biology, this over here is operating through a whole tsunami of mechanisms, all sort of working together. It has to do with the complexity of the body. So this actually turns out to be a very significant, in my view, understanding in terms of what we think about medicine. I'll come back to that later. Now, here's another heresy, if you will. The protein I was using for the most part up until then was a protein that was just available. We could buy it. Everybody was using it in research and things. It turns out the protein that was turning on the cancer was casein. And I paid some attention to it. I really paid some attention to it. Because casein is the main protein of cow's milk. And that's why I said I came from a dairy farm. All of a sudden, my personal life, my everything, is being stood on its head. I mean, here's the most important nutrient, some would say, almost the basis for the dairy industry in those days, getting enough good quality protein, was turning on this cancer. When we tried soy protein and wheat protein, a couple of plant proteins, of course, it didn't do it, even when it's fed at the 20% level. So here is, again, a rather dramatic distinction between there's one animal protein on one hand, 2 plant proteins on the other. It's not a very robust kind of comparison, but because of much of the underlying biochemical research that we did, we were convinced there was a very distinctive difference between animal proteins and plant proteins. And I think it's fair enough, even though we haven't done all the research, of course, it's fair enough to generalize to a great extent about this, that animal proteins in general will have this property compared to plant proteins, the same as animal proteins tend to have the property of increasing your blood cholesterol levels and starting heart disease. The same as animal proteins have a property of being able to grow kids faster than those plant proteins and so forth. And one thing here, it's a sort of a political, I guess, a policy kind of thing. The casein that we were using the criteria that we decide what's a carcinogen, what's not, casein is the most relevant chemical carcinogen ever identified. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I think you may find that quite surprising. Cow's milk protein being the most significant chemical carcinogen ever identified, that's pretty wild stuff. Now I'm just going to kind of flip through a few more observations. We'll come back to this. Here's a more recent publication showing a relationship, let's say, between milk consumption and breast cancer, human breast cancer. Pretty impressive. The higher the milk consumption, the greater the breast cancer risk when you compare different countries. That's really pretty tight sort of relationship. And actually, and I would argue that for the most part, that's due to the protein in the cow's milk, sort of doing that kind of thing. And there's lots of things we now are beginning to know about, at least a lot of things I think we're beginning to know about it to suggest that cow's milk in particular, but animal proteins in general, and or the lack of plant foods, but in any case, animal proteins, cow's milk in particular, is probably raising the risk for breast cancer. A reproductive cancer, of course, in women. And I could go on about a whole talk just talking about the details of that relationship. The same is true for uterine cancer. There's different numbers there. I just put it up there because the relationship, the sort of straight line relationship is about the same. And we men don't get, we're not lucky because we don't have breasts to get breast cancer. Well, I guess few of us do, but in any case, we're stuck with prostate cancer. There's a plot, of the relationship between for prostate cancer with non-fat milk, skim milk. The good old stuff that actually is higher in proteins, fat is low. The higher the skim milk consumption, according to this plot here, the higher the risk for prostate cancer. And I actually have gotten involved to some extent in recent years talking to prostate cancer groups and things like this, where they tend to find that as men get diagnosed with prostate cancer with a higher PSA level, for example, and they take them off of dairy, PSA starts coming down. It's really kind of neat. And I think that there's something there as far as, one of the really, and there's no science here, very little science in this, I just like to make this comment. It's kind of odd that we, as one species, continue to consume milk after our weaning period, more or less for the rest of our life. That's one thing. But then what we do, we turn around and get the milk from another species. That's pretty odd. And if one would really wonder about that a little bit, and you say, well, if the milk is going to have any bad effects on us, what do you think it would hit first? It probably would hit the reproductive tissues that's responsible for producing the milk. I mean, I think there's more to this story than just a whimsical sort of relationship, I think. In any case, let's move on here. And I'm sort of actually showing you some of the highlights, as I said, because eventually you take this and kind of mix it all together, and you got a big story. Here's a relationship showing you a relationship between nutrition and genes. You've heard, cancer runs in the family. It's because of our genes or genetic background. And a lot of people think that. We sort of, imagine that's true. We get cancer, don't get cancer because we have, cancer run in my family. And, I got the genes and all that kind of talk. Well, it turns out that everything starts with genes, specifically with DNA, portions of the DNA. Everything starts with genes, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and it progresses along. But it doesn't end with genes. It starts with genes. Everything starts there. So genes don't matter that much, except in a sort of as part of the structure. They're not too much involved hardly at all in terms of whether or not we get the disease or don't get the disease. What matters is the genes getting expressed, we say, producing the proteins that get produced, that gives rise to enzymes and so forth. And it's the expression of the genes, it's the growing of the products of the genes that gives rise to the cancer, if you will, or other diseases. This is where nutrition comes into play. It's a very exciting concept. Nutrition controls the expression of our genes. I'm kind of jumping ahead and making some generalizations here, but all of us have some genes we would rather not have, I think. We've got genes that do a lot of good stuff for us. We've got a few genes that might not be so good, as I say, we'd rather not have them. It turns out that, and as I jump in way ahead here with other evidence, it turns out that using a diet that has all the right mix of protein and other nutrients, stuff like that, kind of keeps under control our bad genes and helps our good genes to sort of proliferate and produce, and of course, the kind of things that we'd like to have. So here's where that came from, that generalization. We took some animals, this is schematic. We start at the top, we have some normal cells, here little blue dots up there. And so we create in one case we're creating lots of genetic seeds. In other words, you get exposed to carcinogen, and you convert a lot of normal cells to cancer cells, that's the red dots on the left-hand side. On the other side, you create not much seeds, just a little bit. And it turns out if that's all that ever happened in theory, the side that gets the most exposure to the seeds, start out with the most seeds, they get the most tumors. And we actually measure things along that pathway. We actually did this in a laboratory. On the right-hand side, if we start out with few of these cancer seeds, let's call them seeds, we get less tumors. Now, that's common sense, sort of, and there's a lot of evidence to support that. It's pretty straightforward on the one hand, but here's really this is the presumption that everybody has about genes and cancer. You get exposed to more carcinogen, you're going to get more cancer, and so forth and so on. But here was the part that really was very illustrative. It turns out, if you take these two groups down, on the left-hand side, lots of seeds there. If they're given a low-protein diet, they get less tumors. On the right-hand side, they don't have much seeds, but you give them higher protein. On the right, it goes over the left, you get more tumors. So the controlling factor here is not the genes in the first place, for the most part. It's the nutrition that actually controls the expression of these genes. And I could talk about this on and on and on. It turns out in the medical world these days, and especially the medical research world these days, the last 10, 20, even 30 years, we put more and more money in terms of relying on the presumption that genes cause disease and cancer. A lot of money is being put in that. The bulk of the money in NIH, for example, is being put into that particular form in one way or another, lots of direct and indirect studies. But, and very little money put into what really matters into the area of nutrition. The reason we put so much focus on genes, and the reason we talk so much about genes, and the reason that you hear all the time about getting a gene array analysis, for example, seeing what risk you have and what you don't. There's so much emphasis on genes, far too much in my view, because the presumption is, especially since this magnificent development of determining the human genome, these days you can go for a reasonable amount of money and get all of your whole gene analysis done and see what you got and what you don't got and stuff like that. There's so much emphasis on that because there's so much potential money there. You know, in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, the thought was, and pharmaceutical companies for the last 20 years have thought this, that if we can identify the gene that causes, the cancer on the ear, or the gene that causes this or causes that, if we can identify the gene, then we can make a drug. To just hit that particular kind of gene or its product. What a fantastic opportunity to develop new drugs, just by learning all about these genes. Well, it turns out it's not anywhere near as simple as that. Any disease relies on the combined activities, almost infinitely complex and combined activities of many, many genes working together. That's really what we're now learning, and so much of that euphoria for trying to identify genes and do that, and this whole gene array analysis, I have to tell you, for the most part, it's a waste of time and probably a waste of your money, when in fact we can let nature work, eat the right food, and then nature will keep under control those genes, whatever you have. So that was another thing that we did about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I guess now, when I was interested in the gene versus nutrition thing. Now I'm going to turn your attention to some more observations that are kind of neat. This has to do with our China study itself, the project we actually did in China. Up until now, most of the work that we had done was in the laboratory, theoretical, this kind of thing. I was interested in learning a little bit more to see if this was consistent with the human experience. And as we got into this in the early 1980s, this kind of information here was available. Where if you look at this chart here, what you see is a nice straight line comparing different countries. As fat intake, dietary fat goes up, breast cancer goes up. So too, when fat goes up, colon cancer goes up. So does heart disease go up as fat goes up. I mean, that kind of relationship was fairly well established, lots of different studies. You know, we just sort of knew that higher fat diets, higher cancer rates and so forth and so on. It turned out that, you know, it was interesting at the time. Oh, one minute before I tell you that. See that curved line there? That shows what happens when people move from a low-risk area of the world to a high-risk area. They get the disease of the country to which they move. They start using their diet. Now they're going to, you see, that's what that means. There's lots of studies done like that. So it was all focused on fat. And that's why you were told, and I was told in those days, to consume low-fat milk and lean cuts of meat. And we were told low-fat this, low-fat, low-fat everything. And I know that story quite well because it came through policy development of which I was a part, and I know the basis for some of those arguments. But in any case, it was all focused on fat. Actually, it turns out that total fat thing right there, you can see the same line, and I've done it. I don't know whether I have it here or not. I don't think I do. Yes, I do. It's basically animal protein. So as fat goes up in different societies around the world, that was only a surrogate measure of something else. It was a surrogate measure of animal food intake, as indicated here by animal protein. The correlation between fat and animal protein is very, very tight. And so whereas the emphasis on fat in those days is really much better expressed as the relationship with animal food intake. And of course, we add still more to that equation. As animal food intake goes up, plant food intake goes down. So it's partly animal food intake's contributing something, and we're missing something from plant food intake. So now these days we're all the way back to what matters most, and that's consuming plant foods, whole plant foods. But this was sort of the genesis, the seed of some of that kind of thinking with respect to fat. So with that background, we went to China in the early 1980s when the United States and China were first beginning to talk to each other. The first senior scientist from China, Dr. Chen Zhenshu, from the government, of course, came to the United States and spent some time in my laboratory at Cornell. And so while he was there, we learned about his government coming out with this magnificent series of maps or atlases showing how much cancer existed in different parts of China in the 1970s. And what this shows here amongst about 2,400 counties or so in China, and it shows the distribution of breast cancer in China around these different counties. And there were some that had as much as 13 times more breast cancer than other counties. I mean, there's quite a difference. Even though breast cancer in China overall is only about 1/5 of what it is in this country. There's much less breast cancer in China, but there were some pockets of breast cancer in a sense. And so that was also true with other diseases too. So we went to China, set it up. This is the first project between the United States and China, actually, and involved about 24 laboratories around the world, and we really it was quite an exciting time. And I wanted to go to China to sort of see why it is that these diseases tend to be more common in some places, not in others. So we collected blood samples and urine samples and food samples, and we asked questions, and we went in a home and measured exactly what they ate and calculated nutrient. We got a big pile of all kinds of data. And this was a joint project between Cornell University and University of Oxford in England and 2 Chinese academies along the way. So we did this big study, collected all kinds of things to see what was correlated with what. Now, what causes one thing or another is some stuff on the internet that sort of makes that accusation simply not true. It was really about just simply looking at a bunch of correlations to see if the compilation of aggregated amounts of correlation. For those of you in science, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. You're looking for the aggregated collection of to see if there's patterns of correlations. Just simply asking the question whether it's consistent with what we were doing over here and what others are doing. That's what the China study was. Was not determinative, never was intended to be determinative of the final answer as to what we got. But it turned out, because of the unique nature of the Chinese population, the kind of data that we're using, it turned out that what we saw in China supported what we were doing over here in spades. So it was sort of affirmation It was affirmation of much of what we were doing and others were doing to tell us a lot. And I don't, of course, I can tell you lots of different little details about this, that, or something else in China. Or the origin of breast cancer, for example. We got some beautiful data to help us on that. The origin of liver cancer, we got some beautiful information to tell us on that. We did a bunch of different sort of models, as we say, in statistical analysis to see what was causing what. And what we got out of that was this, and I just summarized it. Basically, the vast majority of the hypothetical cause and effect associations favoring less disease actually are associated with the nutrient composition of plant-based foods. And most are statistically significant. Okay? It wasn't pure, it wasn't everything else, but the vast majority was supporting that idea. So, put it in regular language, consuming plant-based whole foods, less total protein, less fat, no animal protein, less chronic degenerative diseases. So you put that idea, a human study, together with some other studies. We were doing also another human study on breast cancer in Buffalo amongst women, and towards sampling their blood. Women having breast cancer at different stages, just prior to breast cancer, high risk, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. And so all of a sudden, we're beginning to aggregate information from human studies, as did many other people, far more studies by my colleagues. But in any case, putting all that together with this sort of more theoretical, laboratory-based stuff, it was fitting like a hand in glove. I mean, it was just really almost unavoidable to conclude anything other than the fact that consuming a whole food, plant-based diet is where it's at. It really was beginning to stack up. So then, at that time, early 90s, when the New York Times actually highlighted our study at the time in a cover story in their science section, I then started looking around a little bit about some colleagues. Did a couple things. Some colleagues of mine who had been working on something like this elsewhere saw it, contacted me. We got together and started talking. And then also at the same time, I went back into scientific literature to see if any of this information had been in the literature, just been ignored maybe. So we did both of those kind of things. And this is probably one of the most remarkable stories. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn in Cleveland Clinic, now a very good friend. He and I lecture together a lot. We just did last weekend in Massachusetts, and we're going to do next week on a cruise in the Caribbean Sea. But in any case, Dr. Esselstyn had been doing something really neat. He was a surgeon, a famed surgeon, Cleveland Clinic. He was doing his thing. And I didn't know him at the time, but he had, in the 1980s, come up with this idea of seeing if he couldn't use a whole food, plant-based diet. In the beginning, he didn't say it that way. In fact, he was using dairy a bit, and he was using some lovastatin in the very beginning. But what he was doing was to show that the dietary effect on women, or no, in this case men, mostly men, that it was so profound it could actually reverse heart disease. And here's his results published. He said, he started out with this is now a 26-year study, by the way, 26-year study. He started out with 18 seriously ill heart patients. Okay? He got in, I asked him when he called me up and invited me to come and give a lecture at this conference he was going to hold. And I was asking him, how did you do that? This was in about the 4th year. And he said, I just got inside their heads. And so that's what Dr. Esselstyn does. If any of you know him, he gets right in there, talks to his patients, and say, hey, you've got to do it this way. He's very clear. You've got to do it. If you want to do this, want to work with me, you have to do it such and such and such and such. So it's pretty rigorous what he does. It makes people believe. So he got 18 patients, put them in an all plant-based diet, except for a little dairy in the beginning. Once he heard about my stuff, he took them off of dairy. But anyhow, low-dose statins. He also, the statins is not part of this game either. He's doing this with diet alone. This is not a statin thing. These 18 people had 49 serious coronary events in the previous 8 years. They were sick. They were really sick. They had heart attacks, bypass surgery, angioplasty operations, whatever. They had 49 coronary events. You put them on this kind of diet. Over the next 12 years, they went from 49 coronary events, and probably several of them should have died by then. They went from 49 to 0. Now you tell me of a drug that even can do almost like 1/10 of that. There's nothing. This is really dramatic for first 12 years. And eventually, he made this conclusion here that all adherent patients, as one stayed with him, they've survived for 20 years. Now it's up to 26 years. there's only been one heart problem amongst these people, and that's a guy who actually strayed from the diet, only proving the point. So there have been 5 deaths, not coronaries, and so these patients live on and experience a lot of good health. And incidentally, that story, how many of you know about forks over knives? Quite a few, yes, you all know that. There's been a film done, for those of you who don't know it. It's called Forks Over Knives. It played across this country and theaters across the country this past summer and last spring. It's now on Netflix, and you can see it. It's really, really doing really well. That film was actually generated because of someone who was listening to my lecture at the time. We got together with Esselton, got some others, and so it's actually sort of summarizing much of what I'm talking about here. Here's Dr. John McDougall on your left, John Barnard on your right. Actually having worked over the years with type 2 diabetics, same kind of diet, by the way. They're doing their thing, and I keep saying that, they're doing their thing, I'm doing my. I just want to say that we're not all getting together and saying, let's draw up a scheme and see what's going on here. I mean, these are people for their own initiative, getting some ideas, coming up with it, which makes the story that much more impressive, I think. Dr. McDougall, who tends not to publish very much, but he certainly had a substantial practice for many, many years. He just has been doing this kind of thing. And Dr. Barnard, president of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, has really done a marvelous job with his organization over the last 20 years. And on diabetes, he's published his results. Take type 2 diabetics, put them on the same kind of diet. They're off their meds in days. It really is just truly amazing. So we've got diabetes, we've got heart disease, hopefully some cancers, some other things. And so finally I got in the literature myself to go back and remind myself a little bit and actually do a little more research to see if in fact there were any other diseases over the years that had exemplified or had illustrated, if you will, some of this effect, and we just ignored it. There's lots of stuff. There really is quite a lot of stuff. I was surprised. And so here's a list of a bunch of illnesses and diseases. Some of them serious, some of them more of the nuisance type. Look at all those. There's a whole variety of different kind of diseases. And it turns out, I just made this table here, it says the same whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and or cures all these diseases. Now that's a mouthful. That really just says to me, this effect is very, very broad. We're talking about something really, really profound. And it's not just about heart disease. It's just about, this, that, or something else. We shouldn't think of it like a pill in treating a certain disease. The same sort of diet, just sort of, it's got infinitely different kinds of combinations of things in that food, all good if it's from plant foods, working together to create, these benefits. It's really quite amazing. So here's my definition of nutrition, which I would suggest is a new way of thinking about nutrition. In my day, and a lot of people think about it still these days, and this is what I taught as well, we tended to understand nutrition, and I would teach a class this way with my students. Let's look at one nutrient at a time, see what it does. Let's look at its chemical structure. Let's see how it gets metabolized. Let's see what it does and this and that, as we go through the different vitamins and minerals, especially those micronutrients. Well, we looked at it one thing at a time. We just think that way. So we've always thought that way, whether in science or in medicine, or whether we're just in the public. We think about, we're looking for the magic bullet or the magic, whatever it is that causes problems. And so it's not that's not nutrition. That's turned into this nutrient supplement industry, thinking that way. Now a $30 billion industry in this country where people want to take single nutrients. Maybe you put 2 in the pill, or maybe 3, same thing. You put nutrients in there, and then you take stuff, and you're going to get health. It's not working out. The reviews of the studies on that over the years has not borne that out. As a matter of fact, taking nutrient supplements, there's evidence that they cause harm in some cases. So that, and the worst thing about nutrient supplements, it tends to divert our attention away from what we ought to be looking at, as if we're getting health. That's not health. So I'm getting towards something here, and it really has to do with this definition. Basically, nutrition involves integrated effects of countless food constituents. I really mean countless. We don't know the number. I mean, it's just huge. It involves infinitely complex mechanisms. That's why I showed you every time we looked for a mechanism, we couldn't find one. I mean, there's just mechanisms that come out of we can't even put it in our heads. You know, all these different things working together. And produce comprehensive health. That means all those different diseases. Just think about how, on the one hand, although this is complex biologically, on the other hand, the bottom line is virtually the same. So nutrition, if you parcel it out and you say, okay, here's what nutrition is, I don't like to think of it quite that way. It's actually part of a lifestyle. But when nutrition is supported by exercise and rest and hydration and water is important, by the way. You've got to keep yourself hydrated. Supported by exercise, rest, water, and sunshine is greater than the sum of its parts. It's like a biological symphony, what I call the wisdom of the body. I never would have thought I'd have said that being in science years ago. But our bodies have, first off, they have about 100 trillion cells. I don't know who came up with that number, but that's a rough estimate. 100 trillion cells. We can't see a cell, of course. We have to look under a microscope to see one cell. But in each and every one of those 100 trillion cells, there's a whole universe of activity, a whole universe. And even the dimensions between all the different parts of the cell, the distance from one part to another is so great, it's almost like looking out the universe that way. The universe going down, the universe out that way. And the complexity is just amazing. So we have to change our thinking, about what is health, what is nutrition. And within that whole system, our body has evolved over this millions of years, zillions of years, to create this symphony that we have forgotten about. We simply don't understand it. We just sort of, that's nature. That's what it is. And we can think about, how does that get controlled? And, we think about homeostasis, in case you know things about that. I've actually just finished writing a second book on this whole concept because it has some interesting history, some interesting economics, some interesting philosophy, that when we think about things in that context, with good science as underpinning, it really is this thing about, you've heard the expression, the devil's in the details? That was a pretty old expression. It's for real, it's a good statement. Or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, another good statement. Or let's say, you are what you eat, another good one. I mean, these are really ancient, old expressions. And so now we're getting the science to prove all those things. People said those things long time ago were pretty smart. They didn't have the science necessarily, but they're true. They really are. And you put all that stuff together, you get some exciting ideas out of this. So where does nutrition... Okay, now I'll leave you with that thought. Nutrition is important. Okay, where does it fit in? Where does it fit in? It doesn't. It's kind of a negative thing, but it doesn't. If you stop and think, we're really ignorant. Most of us are pretty ignorant about nutrition. And my colleagues especially, they don't think like this thing, the holistic thing that I talk about. They still want to do the reductionist kind of thing. You're looking at one thing at a time, and I'll mention that in just a moment. But somehow nutrition doesn't fit in, and here's the evidence for it. It's very confusing for the public. Very confusing. And I don't know two people who would agree on anything about this. And there's a reason for it being so confusing. Research funding hardly exists. And in that particular context, what I'm talking about is something like NIH, NASA Institutes of Health, who funded almost all of my research over the years, especially the National Cancer Institute. NIH is made up of 27 institutes and centers and programs. National Heart Institute is over here, National Cancer Institute here, and blood, well, I can't name them all, of course, but there's all these different institutes, each focused on something, usually on a disease basis, but there isn't a single institute called the Institute of Nutrition. Now, what I just told you, in my view, is the single most important thing we need to know as far as medicine and health practice is concerned and disease causation. But NIH has maybe 2 or 3% by their own admission of some funds in heart and cancer, those institutes, to put their nutrition. And most of that little bit of money is actually being used to test single nutrients, to see whether certain nutrient supplements work, trying to help the nutrient supplement industry. It's nothing to do with nutrition. It has to do with pharmacology. Doctors aren't trained. Big thing. There's not a medical school in the United States that teaches nutrition, really. not anywhere near adequate. Oh, there's some courses, yes, and there's some medical programs might have 15 or 20 lectures as an elective, something like that for people to take. But most of them just, and that's not enough. So nutrition is not taught in the medical community, and you have to wonder why not. I'll tell you in a moment. National policy standards also are corrupted by the food and drug industries. And I've seen this firsthand. I've been a party to it as a co-author and member of these panels, when I wasn't thinking quite straight, sort of being part of the scheme of things. And so I know how, science is taken to condense it down to put it in a form, to make things like, I'll just show you some examples just in a minute. So all that stuff is playing a game here. So nutrition just doesn't fit, that old story. Now I'm going to just finish up with some stuff on policy. Because I just said, when you get into policy, that's where a lot of problems exist. And by way of illustration, I'm going to show you this. It was in the China study, the book you've seen, so there's nothing new for you folks who've seen the book, but it's a pretty good example. I could show this over and over again in different years for the different policies. In nutrition, we have two policy communities that do work to determine what should be our national standards and national policy. One of them is the Food Nutrition Board that comes up with telling us every 5 years how much of each nutrient should be used. Recommended Dietary Allowance, RDA. They pass off their report to the second group, which is the USDA Dietary Guidelines Committee. They're the ones that take all this fancy science and make pictures. They make pyramid. You've heard of the food pyramid? They used to talked about one time having a circle, making a pie chart. They do these things to make little pictures so we can try to understand all that. Well, let me show you in 2002 what they did. And this is on the first page of about a 900-page report. So this is featured right up front. Most people only look at the first page anyhow, let's face it. So here's what they said. For minimizing risk for chronic disease, we may consume diets up to 35% protein. And I just told you before, Aravish showed 10% is enough. You go in excess of 10%, you're asking for trouble. And so now they're saying 35% protein. There were some Atkins sympathizers on that committee at the time, by the way. 35% fat. We're talking about getting fat way down, like 10, 12%. 35% fat. And then this last one here is just, boy, that tastes the cake. Yeah, cake. They talk about cakes, actually. They say 25% of our calories can be in the form of sugars, refined carbohydrates. Candy, soft drinks, that's put in quotes. I don't have time to get into all the politics behind that, but that came out and said about 25% of our total calories can come from that stuff. Just think about that. The rest of it can come from animal-based foods. So my son and I put together a sample menu. This is the nutrition of the future. This is where it works. I mean, I saw this report, and I've been on those kind of panels, not this one. Thank God I wasn't on this one. But I knew some friends on there, and I called them up and just tell you the story of one person that I talked to. I won't give his name because he was a friend. He's a good guy, but I'll tell you why he got on there. I called him up. Let's call him Joe just for the heck of it. I said, Joe, do you know the report you just put out? I started going through this and stuff, and he was a little defensive. He was the chair of the subcommittee that decided the upper limit. So I said, you said this, you said that. You didn't put in this, you didn't put in that. I was kind of challenging. And I think he was a little defensive. He said, well, wait a minute, now. We were arguing a bit. And finally he said, because he said to me, he says, Colin, I've known him for 30 years. He says, Colin, he says, you know I don't know anything about nutrition. And here he is sitting on that position. He was on the committee because he was a fairly distinguished scientist, but in toxicology. And he wasn't really in nutrition. And so he didn't know what his subcommittee had really done. So it begs the question, who's controlling things around here? These people here are. These are the ones who actually signed on in very fine print as having provided some funding for this, and a lot of funding. I don't know exactly how much. When I first talked to the chair of the chair of the group, she didn't know, I guess, what I was going after. She says, only 49% of the money was from these industries. As if 49%, we don't vote by, dollars and cents. It's crazy. The Dannon Institute is the dairy industry. Very powerful dairy industry. International Life Sciences Institute, that sounds pretty good. Good science in there, right? That's a coalition of soft drink companies. Soft drink companies, beverage companies. Corporate Donors Fund, they can put some money in there and not get named. Roche Vitamins and Mead Johnson, drugs, if you will. M&Rs, that's where the sugar thing, I think, came from probably. And they get academic support. Most of the people on these committees, distinguish themselves one way or another, usually in science, doesn't have to be on the topic. But the chairs are picked, and then they pick other people to be on the committees, and it's quite a story. I want to just share with you 3 or 4 more things, because there's something really important here, I think. In 2005, when our book came out in January, I got a phone call from the chair, not the chair, the senior editor of Newsweek. I won't give her name, but she called and interviewed me, and she had seen the book, and she was excited about it. And I thought, wow, she talked as if she really wanted to make a big story in Newsweek about this. And maybe, I got the impression, that's all I can say. She didn't say that, but maybe on the cover as an article, she seemed to be so excited about it. But in any case, she said, I'll get back to you. I got to take it back to the committee of other editors to see where we go with this kind of thing. I didn't hear any more after that. And then that was in February when she did this. In May, this issue came out in Newsweek. Well, I know it because we were subscribers. And I thought, wow, this is pretty nice. They're going to feature on, health for the 21st century. This is nice. And so I opened it up and started leafing through the pages and sort of wondering where am I going to see the big section on diet and nutrition. Of the 17, there was more or less 17 articles in that magazine, not one was on nutrition. It was all about coming up with new ways of developing drugs and surgical techniques and genetic engineering and stuff like that. That's the future of medicine. So I opened it up, read this little piece in here by the editor-in-chief, which I credit him for being honest about things. I'll read you this. We are pleased that Johnson & Johnson chose to be the exclusive advertiser for this special issue. As I trust Newsweek readers expect, the advertiser had no influence over the editorial content of this magazine. So we stopped our subscription. This is what is happening, and the public doesn't know it. This is really what I want to say. The public does not know this. I think the public is getting wise and suspicious of this, but I don't know how many of you would really know this kind of detail, I suppose. Here's another thing. Our professional societies, good organizations from the beginning, intended to do good work, aggregations of us scientists in different disciplines working together and things. And unfortunately in my society, the American Institute of Nutrition, now called the American Society of Nutritional Sciences, but in any case, another one called the American Dietetic Association, ADA. ADA is the organization that's largely controlling and responsible for the training of registered dietitians, the RDA, registered dietitians, RDs, come under that rubric, right? And they also have a lot to say about the licensing of licensing procedures on state-by-state basis. So I've spoken to them a couple of times in years past, not so controversial, I wasn't quite that way, I guess, but about 3 years ago, I think it was, when was it? October or something, I think it was 2008. In any case, I was invited to come and give, one of the main talks. And then I heard there was quite a lot of hand-wringing. There was some fighting on the inside of the organization whether I should be asked. But anyhow, I went there, and it was a pretty good turnout. But when I went there, and my wife came along, and we stopped at the registration desk to pick up our little registration bag. And here's what the registration bag says, right boldly, right on the outside of the registration bag. ADA partners. In other words, the people providing funding. Aramark, one of the big companies that sort of manages a lot of the school lunch programs and food service systems and stuff like that. Coca-Cola. GlaxoSmithKline, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, National Dairy Council, PepsiCo, Unilever. These are the people that really are able to pull the strings. Now you think, just stop and think about this. This is essentially a nonprofit, trying to do good work. They need some money, I understand that, but they go out and they eventually sell themselves to these companies who actually control, behind the scenes what's going on. I'm going to finish off with just a little scheme here. And I think, I really mean for this to be fairly serious. When we think as citizens about, we like to think we know what we're doing. We'd like to think that way. And we'd like to think that whatever we choose to do is backed by decent science. And to the extent that we understand some science, we can find here, find there. When you find something that supports what you believe, you get excited about it. So we'd like to think we're getting good evidence. And I'm going to show you the scheme by which this happens. You start out with science. This is sort of the scheme of things in a general way. Science, to me, is the art of observation. It only means going out, looking around. You're all scientists. You go out and look around, you see something, you say, I think that's true. Put this. You can think of your own ideas about anything. You're just observing. We all make observations all the time. But sometimes, we're making an observation about health, something like that. We can form hypotheses. Then we say, okay, let's do some research to see if that's true or not. So we take this idea, we form a hypothesis, go in the laboratory, design some stuff, and learn some things about it. We get some study designs going, and we produce the evidence. Now the evidence is coming out, good science, good scientific evidence, evidence-based medicine, you hear all that kind of stuff. It's passed on to the consumers, and the consumers use it to get help. That's what we'd like to think it is, and sort of like the ideal situation. In reality, it's not. Basically, it comes down to the evidence. The evidence doesn't go straight to the consumers. The evidence gets filtered. The evidence is taken off to the other side. If, in fact, you have intellectual property protection, IPP. The evidence they created, usually narrow bits of evidence, about this pill, this nutrient, this disease, that nutrient. As long as there's intellectual property protection, that means this new information that's just been obtained can make it in the marketplace. Goes to the industry making products. These products are actually a derivation. They're derived from very reductionist, narrowly focused ideas. That's why intellectual property protection demands that. Getting patents and stuff means focus. And so the system within which we live demand that we focus our ideas. Focus. One thing at a time, one disease, one mechanism, one this. And so when we get it in that form, then we can get some intellectual property protection, whether it's patents, trademarks, or copyrights, or whatever it happens to be. It goes over there, and then a little bit of it dribbles back maybe to create some real health, but very little. Basically, we consumers buy those products. So we keep the industry going because we buy those products. We're told, okay, this is good. We buy the products. $30 billion industry, nutrient supplement industry, for example. We buy them. Drugs, just think about that. We rely on that kind of stuff. And then we pay them to keep it going, but then we are taxpayers. We turn around and put tax back into the system. NIH and all the funding that it does too, it basically is taking taxpayer money and keeps this motor going. It's an engine. So we citizens who are supposedly hoping that we're getting something health out of this big initiative. In fact, I think it's being sandbagged. In large measure because of our own volition. We are part of the problem. I don't want to just sort of go and knock on the door of some particular group and say, no, you're all bad. No, the industry they're there. They're trying to make something go. A lot of good people making bad habits, but a lot of good people really believe in them making good habits. Because they're selling us goods that somehow the marketplace wanted. That's the way industry is, let's face it. I accept that. That's the free market system. But I just want to say it for a fact. This is what's really happening. That we are not inquiring enough to know. Here's another way of looking at it. Instead of coming down directly to the consumers, in this case, I'm showing it goes to public policy. As I say, I've been involved in that too. Public policy makes for public information, whether it's labels on the side of the cereal boxes, or whether it's for the school lunch program, or whether it's for women, infants, and children program, or whether it's for subsidizing hospital-based food programs. And you see the 2 stars here? At every step along the way, the corporate sector is involved and controlling. And I put that rather strange thing up there. It said many industry. I should spell it out. I thought I did. It's actually the media. The media, together with the industry, actually form the information and responds to their advertisements, puts it out, and we are the unwitting victims, this whole system. It's distressing in a way. The system, I won't go there, I just explained enough about that. Nutrient definition, I already showed you that. I'm going to just finish up and just say, for those, any of you interested, we have a nonprofit foundation that's run along with a group of Cornell. It's a for-profit segment of Cornell University that does online courses for Cornell faculty, so I have access to that. We have what we believe is a really nice online program for people to take, and it's working out pretty good. We now are able to offer 19 Class 1s continuing medical education credits, as well as some other kinds of credits for other professionals, credits for dietitians, and it's growing very rapidly. A third of our students now are actually online. It's a unique, and I have to give credit to Cornell having figured this out. But for 2 weeks, you can take a course of about 6 lectures. Many of them are mine. You listen to the course, if you listen to lectures over a 2-week period, you're a member of a class of about 30, a virtual class of about 30 all over. And then we have a professional instructor. There's a professional instructor with every class. And a professional instructor throws out every day a question, a thought piece, and all those 32 students have to contribute to that discussion if they want a certificate or get the credit. And the discussions that go on between the students is just really exciting. Students teach, people teaching people about the kind of questions, so it's really turned out to be kind of nice. That's the book that some of you haven't seen. My son, I think I mentioned, he was in theater at Cornell, and for any of you who don't know, he came back to work with me and helped me write the story, and got excited about medicine, went back to medical school, now has a medical degree actually, and is just 2 years into his residency. I had to do this. I have a daughter. We have a daughter too. And she just came out just these past few days with a cookbook. People have been asking about that. Why don't you get a cookbook? The China study doesn't have a cookbook. So and there's others. There's other good cookbooks out there. This just came out called the Whole Plants Cookbook. There you have it. Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So we actually have just enough time for about 10 minutes of questions. If you would like to ask a question, we have positioned microphones in each aisle. Just go whenever you want to. And we'll start over here. Right here.
Dr. Campbell, hi. It's Danny Waxman from Philadelphia. I have a practical question. I've been involved in nutritionist therapy for nearly 40 years. In recent years, people have been shying away from the gluten grains, wheat and barley, as well as soy products as part of a healthy plant-based diet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Danny, I should be asking you, what are your thoughts on it? Danny Waxman, as many of you may know, is very much in this game too. I really don't know whether there's some evidence that it's been hyped up a little bit too much, but we know that gluten sensitivities are a problem. I mean, that's been pretty well demonstrated. I suspect you agree. And how many people really involved or not, I just don't know. I just don't know that. I mean, it's real. Yeah, it's real, I think.
Right.
No, that's not the issue. The issue is, how real is it? And there's some arguments being made, as you know, about the idea we haven't been exposed to grains that long in our evolutionary history. And so we haven't accommodated the physiology to be able to handle that as well as we might. And so, what's your thoughts on it? I don't...
Since wheat and barley are two of the principal grains, it seems to me it must be their interaction with other foods in our diet, namely dairy foods, tropical fruits, and fructose outside of fruit. I think it's the combination. so that wheat and barley are not really the culprit, but the precipitator.
It's a complex relationship.
Right.
But if people discover they have these allergies to those kind of grains, best thing to do, avoid them and just see what happens.
Right.
I think that's the best way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.